Welcome, sales professionals, to Sales Trainers List and Sell Online. This is where we focus fundamentally in an overall or a comprehensive way in you moving into traction. This makes the assumption that you have indeed made those inroads in and around foothold, that you have got seed listings or have got them on top. It doesn't matter if you're here and you haven't done that. So this is basically the next stage in your development. And what we're looking at is, in today's subject matter, I should say, session T2, traction, T204 in the second phase, is basically about prospecting. And it will be about prospecting traction-wise, that particular phase. I'm also very mindful of the fact that not only are we looking at the traction phase in building it, but if you need to get foothold, when you need to jump back and get onto Prospector School online, which deals fundamentally with foothold. That's not to say, we've got people all the way up in Real Estate Rockstar that are embracing right now the foothold stage in breaking new markets, because obviously the way the strategy rolls out, if you get on top and you get a 30% market share, you want to get that into momentum, then you might covet a bigger market, which means you've got to move sideways and then you go back to the beginning. But here we're going to talk about, in the concept of prospecting and prospector, soon to be Prospector 4 is the latest iteration. And we want to talk about traction. So traction is about, you've already got a seed listing, and fundamentally what you need to comprehend is that becomes your voice in the market. Now, I want to take this to another level so that most salespeople understand this. I've had incredible frustration with a couple now, and I don't get frustrated, I do get fascinated, but I have had incredible frustration with a lot of sales professionals that have failed to actually understand the importance of leverage and how it operates. If you miss those opportunities to leverage, you are literally putting yourself on the back foot with the next step of where it is that you want to go. Because what you're going to suffer is this stop-start. The moment you get a listing, stop thinking about selling the property. Let me use as a case in point a simple explanation of traction and leverage in the context of the open for inspection. So often I talk to agents about this, and they'll tell me, yeah. So I do the open for inspection, or the welcome home, as we call them, invitation. When people come to the open for inspection, I greet them. I do try to qualify them or find out which ones are sellers. And then I move into the next stage of calling them up in the afternoon. Now, I'll show you some of the faults I'm seeing readily appear in and around the leverage that they're doing purely on this aspect. So this has a direct correlation to the big three, and I'll come back to that in a second. But the moment you have listings, the moment you are privileged enough to actually have listings on the market, a whole new world opens up to you in and around traction. And if you are clever, if you run this to the letter, you really don't have to engage in many other prospecting methods at all, because by virtue of the fact that you have a listing, you're going to generate inquiry. Now, we know through the phases model, from the beginning, and you can go back and check this on Prospector School, or I will probably talk about this or bring this into Sales Trainer or List and Sell Online at a later stage, but the beginnings. So how it starts is a seller wants to research the market, to arrive at their own conclusion on what the comparative value of the property is. So that's basically the data collection phase that runs from anywhere to as little as 4 weeks to as long as 12 weeks. So we know when you first receive an inquiry that it's going to be somewhere on that timeline. generally speaking, if it's in the first 4 weeks, there's no real need to go back and follow that up. However, if you look at the opportunity that's going to arise around running welcome homes, the opportunity to identify that seller readily exists. And further to that, if you can establish the right premise of the connection you make with that active property seller, well, then you can be not just definitely on the shopping list when they enter the presentation phase, but you can also ensure yourself or position yourself so that you are the agent of choice moving forward. Now, so often we forget that this takes a protracted time. So if we look at the phases, we say 4 to as long as 12 weeks to research the market. Once they arrive at that conclusion, they enter the presentation phase. This window exists for about 4 weeks, and you need to be on that shopping list before they hit that receptive level, unless you can jag them timing wise, and that's difficult to do. And then once they've done that, they could take up to another 4 weeks, from 0 to 4 weeks, to actually select an agent. So there's lots of opportunity there, provided you position yourself the right way and you don't want to get ahead of yourself. So let's just have a look at it. Yeah. So the invitation goes out. Is your invitation such that it says that the invitation basically says, we'd like you, if you, and it's going to neighboring properties, if you're researching the market ahead of selling, we'd like you to check out our welcome home. While you're there, don't forget to ask our rep about any of our other pre-release listings and grab your copy of the Property Seller's Research Guide. Now, if you don't have a Property Seller's Research Guide, you need to get one. You maybe need to talk to us, but you do need to have some sort of documentation that is centric to an active property seller. Now, what have we done? In the first instance, we've got a seller that's actually received this communication. You're openly inviting them to attend your open for inspection, independent of the need to be a buyer, to be looking at it in the context of buying it. That person turns up. Now, then what you have to ensure is that the behavior that you have at that point is completely consistent with the invitation that you've sent. So often I'm talking to salespeople and I ask, what's the greeting like? What do they do at the open for inspection? And here's what they say. Oh, yeah, I remember that bit where you sort of said, because they guess what I'm going to say, where they walk in. And they basically, those of you that can see me, if you're not actually looking on audio, I'm nodding my head as I say this. Good afternoon, my name's Mark Dwyer. How are you? People say, give me their name. And I say, so what are we doing today, folks? Buying or selling, as I'm nodding my head, because that's going to elicit the right answer. And then I say, because for sellers researching the market, we have a Property Seller's Research Guide. Now, this is an irresistible thing for a seller to grab hold of. So it is fundamentally important that that is consistent. So that's it. So the first breakdown I see is that the invitation didn't go out, or the invitation wasn't centric to saying to an active property seller that you can come and have a look at it. Second mistake is that we're not actually saying to them, we're not qualifying them in the quick qualify, are we buying or selling? And because we're not offering something of value to them as a property seller, they're not able to readily identify themselves, which they're not going to want to do, because at this stage, they're not in a space where they want to engage the services of an agent. But if you allow them to be identified, they will. Now, it's important, once they do identify themselves, that you don't smother them, that you basically, should they take it, if there is nobody else at the open home, you could get moving to these questions. If there's a whole lot of people, just save this stuff for later. But I would look at them and I would say, so tell me, where are you moving from? Doesn't matter if I don't get the actual street address. And where are you moving to? And all of the conversation needs to be centric to those things. You see, because this is what represents a position of care on what those people are doing. Do not move into this space where can we come down and give you an idea or an opinion on where the property might sit in the marketplace. You've got to avoid this attitude of what can we offer you in terms of selling the property. In fact, one of the words that I've actually eliminated from my vocabulary in certain those real estate rock stars and sales professionals that I'm advising, all the way down to sales associates shouldn't say down, but all the way down the chain to sales associates that are prospecting, is stop saying the sell word. Stop saying, do you have to sell? More about, where are you moving to? Are you planning a move? If you could move, when are you likely to do that? Because if the conversation is centric to the move, this demonstrates care, which is synonymous with professionalism, giving a toss, giving a shit, as I often say. Then the third phase is the welcome home follow-up, which needs to be on a Monday or a Tuesday. Now, I know a lot of you have followed the leader with what your competition are doing, and you think the notion of following them up on a Saturday afternoon, following up people that have been through, is the way to go. I could not disagree more. Now, if somebody came through and demonstrated that they're interested as a buyer, absolutely, I have no problem with you following them up on a Saturday afternoon. But if there was no interest and there's a strong understanding that they are likely to be a property seller, following them up on the same day is bloody useless. It's unproductive. It doesn't demonstrate anything clever at all, if you ask me. Because then you can move in on the Monday, make the call and run the assumptive close. We know how that works. Hi, sorry to bother you. My name's Mark Dwyer. We met at an open for inspection on Saturday at number 16 Lovegrove Place. Look, I won't ask you about this one because if you liked it, I'm assuming you would have let us know on Saturday. Yeah. Now, you guys are selling, weren't you? Or you guys were moving, weren't you? And then moving into the same dialogue. So if they say, yes, I can move into the same dialogue. I know that contradicts me a little bit about selling, but what I'm saying is my conversation is not centric to the word sell. My conversation is centric to the move and making all of that possible. You see, what this is consistent with and what is, I guess, failing to penetrate, or perhaps I have failed to explain it in the best context that I possibly can. And I'm hoping that I'm getting better at explaining this and that it does sink in. You see, I'll just give you a case in point of one of the salespeople that I was dealing with this week that we were talking and were discussing a particular property in the context of leverage off that listing. So the first question I had for this salesperson was, when you thought about this property and it then became available and you're now bringing it to market, what were you thinking in terms of what needs to be achieved around it? And great, thankfully, that salesperson was quite honest. He said to me, well, I was thinking about getting it sold. There was some resistance. They were talking off market. They then agreed to put it on. And I'm thinking about how do I jag a buyer and get the property sold, which is probably directly correlated to the fact that, you know, needs to make sales to make money to be paid. I get that. But I've got to tell you, people, if you focus on running the production line, if you focus on leverage and you keep the listings coming in, the money will come. Stop focusing on just getting a property sold, because this is causing stop-start. Let me explain what I mean. So this property that was open for inspection, on its first open for inspection, yes, the invitations were sent out, had 14 parties through the first one. In the second week, it had a further 4. And in the third week, it had 7, and now it's sold. So 3 weeks of open for inspections, 25 parties through. My immediate response to all of this in the first instance, in the first open inspection with 14, is I know the conversion ratio is 7-to-1. So I asked, how many sellers were identified from that first open for inspection? 0. What about week 2? 0. What about week 3? 0. Now I said, look, the reality is that there are 25 parties that have come through. So there has to be somewhere between 3 to 4 active property sellers there that you've failed to identify. But here's where it gets worse. I said, what is the open for inspection centric to? Now, this salesperson didn't really understand that question, but I can tell you, as I said to him, it's centric to you selling it. So a seller, an active property seller, could be forgiven if they've made an error in judgment by the way that's been run and it hasn't felt conducive to, number one, servicing them, or number two, to them actually listing the property with you. This kind of threw this salesperson. I said, look, what you have to understand, and it's most important that every person that's on here right now thoroughly comprehends this. The reality is that when you list a property, you no longer have to engage in foothold procedures and you no longer have to go out there and find sellers. What you need to understand and run the assumption on is this: your next seller is already watching you. So the message that emanates from that sign in the immediate vicinity will determine whether or not you win that listing. And I've said this on numerous occasions. If we look at the big 3, the first one is sales inquiry. We talked about that just a few moments ago. And I said, basically, what you need to do is collate that inquiry, understanding that you may not be able to identify them, or you may not be able to get the listing presentation until they've at least done their research, which is 4 to 8 weeks. So you need to collate that data in the form of a contact list, and be mindful that you're going back to harvest after it's about 4 weeks of age, and realistically until it's about 3 months of age. Yeah, so once it gets to about 12 weeks, you can safely assume that it's kind of depleted. Most people will have made their move by then. So we know that that's the conversion ratio in sales inquiry. If we move to the next phase, which is the welcome home, I ask you, is your welcome home centric to identifying and impressing sellers? I've said this a number of times. The welcome home needs to be almost a virtual listing presentation. Now, I want to release you on something to get you to thoroughly understand it. We make the open for inspection centric to a buyer, but it's kind of superfluous. You see, a buyer's looking for a home, and when they make that connection, whether the open home, was the shittiest event they've ever actually attended, they'll still buy it. Whether the real estate salesperson who has listed that property is a complete dunderhead when it comes to negotiation, they will still buy it. Whether that agency fails to give them the service and all that sort of stuff that they need to buy it, they will do it despite it. And if they don't, here's the point: there is always another buyer. Now, look, this doesn't mean that I want you to discard sales. I'm just saying don't focus on it, certainly in the initial stages. What you need to do is, when you go to an open for inspection, your mindset needs to be, which ones are the sellers, and is my open for inspection conducive to that active property seller walking in and saying, I just have to list my property with this company, with this sales professional. This needs to be your area of paranoia. You see, because the buyers don't care, there'll always be another buyer. But here's the important point, and I hope you write this down and never forget it. You don't get a second chance with a seller. If a seller turns up to that open for inspection and you fail to do something which is consistent with the invitation that you've sent out, if you make them feel unwelcome, or they even perceive that they're unwelcome to be looking at that property as an active property seller, yeah, and they should be a buyer, well, then they'll pretend they're a buyer. But here's the dangerous part. They then may make the decision without your knowledge, because you failed to identify them, that they will not be using your company going forward. And you can't measure that. So here was my point that I ran with the salesperson that had the 25 through over 3 open for inspections that should have actually converted to at least a couple of listings, but an opportunity was there for, say, 3 to 4 listings to be on board. Remembering I said that the conversion ratio for attendees at Welcome Homes is 1 in 7 in the first month. So this one that I talked about, it's got a month to go, a week, I should say, to go, where that conversion ratio still exists, where that leverage still exists. You see, your sellers are already watching you. It's yours to win. You have a voice in the marketplace. You have to make it centric to the seller, because if it's centric to the seller and it does all those things, you're going to get continuity. You're not going to be looking at this stop start. You can leverage, you can turn 1 listing readily into 2, 2 into 4. My point to you is, and it needs to be clearly understood. Clearly understood. It's not that the sellers aren't there. It's what you're doing and saying to make them feel comfortable with the identification. And then you're maybe failing to move into the space where you are offering them advice, not price, with no strings attached. What do I mean? Give on the understanding that you may not get the listing. What this will do will open and align to abundance for you, and you'll have more opportunities than you actually need. This is why we talk about inside the prospector strategy that you want to prospect to have a surplus of opportunities. What does this do? It gives you confidence. You don't have to, when we get to the listing presentation, engage in offering fee discounts. You don't have to engage in offering free marketing and that sort of stuff, because you've got abundance. If you've got abundance, you can feel comfortable in the fact, so long as your fee structure is fair and reasonable, your product is consistent with the fee level that you're charging, that you can just move forward without the constraints that other agents, I guess, leverage themselves into. It's pretty simplistic, guys. So that's just that part. Now, then we move to the third phase, which of course is the regenerative prospector process. And it's fairly simple. You've got to understand that the trading of information, the communication, whether directly or indirectly with active property sellers, is such that you are not giving information on condition. You are actually freely offering that advice. You're staying away from price. Now, at first, you might feel a little, I guess, uncomfortable with the idea of staying away from price because you've become accustomed to it. But just understand that you've leveraged yourself into that position. You don't need to give estimations on value of property as long as you can give explanation as to how it works. My point that I challenge you on is this: do you truly understand the difference between market value and comparative value? Comparative value is just a history lesson. Even then, it's still subjective. It's nothing more than a guide or a benchmark that people can hang their hat to. And that the interpretation of that comparison is, again, subjective. So your owner's going to err on the side of optimism. Yeah. You're maybe going to err on the side of, what have I got to do to get it sold? And the buyers, well, they're going to just basically look at their capacity to pay and what the agent indicates that they think it's worth, and whether or not they have that connection with the property, whether or not they love that property. It's a simple analogy, guys. I mean, my frustration, if there is one, so I'll say, don't get frustrated, get fascinated. My fascination is that you're not, that as salespeople, we're not stopping and thinking it through. Please understand, every single time you have a listing, you have a voice in the marketplace, you have a leverage point where potentially you can build your market share immediately. but you have to figure out how to identify the seller in the first instance, then offer them advice rather than price. So make all of the conversation centric to the motive, build the advice on that, then start to offer a value proposition. Show your product, let them see the value inside that product and communicate it to them. Then I believe you'll be afforded the opportunity to present. Now, in later editions of this, I'll talk about, how it should be a listing education rather than presentation. So you should present an educative and informative disposition because people just don't understand. And then you can have sellers, active property sellers, readily selecting you. In fact, you won't have to close them. They will close you. Because if you can show value that is beyond compare, beyond the comparison of your competitors, they will not only be happy to pay the fee that you set, they'll be not only happy to invest in the marketing that you put in place because you understand how, as a salesperson, to sell it. And something I'm very eager to teach salespeople is this, that you need, to understand that the quickest way to get people to buy something is make it easy for them to buy. And I reckon the quickest way to sell them something is tell them they can't have it. Now, you might not be brave enough to make that move right now, but give me time and I'll show you how you can make that move not only comfortably, not only successfully, but to the level of listings and sales that gives you a nice lifestyle loaded up with prosperity. If you're worried about money, it's only because you don't have enough of it. And the reason you don't have enough of it is because you're too focused on it rather than providing the service, product, and solution to problems that property sellers need. My name's Mark Dwyer. This has been Sales Trainers List and Sell Online. You can reach me, Mark, with a K, at salestrainer.com.au, on my phone number +61 410 592 165. Feel free to call me if you'd like to get involved in Sales Trainer Mentor, or indeed understand some of the products that I've talked about in prospecting, and indeed as we move forward, making sure that you win the listing presentations favorably. Thank you.